Andy Moore, Automotive Group Hotline. I got more stuff to give away, too. The Hammer House Party coming to Ruoff Mortgage Music Center. That's, I think, more of a me and a Mike Wells re-entry coming up here at the bottom of the hour. We utilize Thomas Rhett for our next guest from the Indianapolis Star. He writes regarding the IU Hoosiers. Zach Osterman joins us now. Hello, Zach. How are you?
Hey, how we doing?
Is it cool to live in Bloomington and then do what you do as a part of the Indianapolis Star? That seems like a pretty good benefit right there.
Yeah, it's not a bad place to spend some time. I mean, it's a little bit different from when I went to school here. I don't think you're going to find me at Kilroy's on a Tuesday night down in Peach, Long Island, like I did back when I was definitely, going to class and worrying about my homework and all those things. But it's still a fun little place to spend some time, even in your 30s.
Now, are you allowed to go out? Do you go out down there, or do you not go out because of the chance of running into people?
No, I have an infant son. I go almost nowhere. So the odd concert, Turnpike Troubadours is in town this weekend. I'll probably get out to that. But
where are they, at the Bluebird?
Yeah. Oh yeah. That's where anything worth seeing is going to be at the Bluebird.
Ooh, Bluebird. That reminds me of the days of Situation Gray and the Chosen Few and the Y Store and Real Eyes. Those are some good old days back then, Zach.
I think I'm trying to remember the first time I saw Clayton Anderson there, and I'm probably giving away my preferences for country. But I mean, I grew up in Georgia, so we like what we like.
Yeah, we played a little REM, and you're honored to bring you in here, too, because I know that REM's fellow Georgians, as you are. I want to ask you this first. Before we get into IU, and everybody's trying to break down what they have to do, and I think what they have to do is fairly obvious, okay? We'll get into that in a second, though, even if it is obvious. But was it the bench shadow that has sparked what we have seen recently, and especially on Saturday, from Justin Smith? Because he'd been incredibly disappointing for the most part this year. And when you have to point the finger, or can point the finger at somebody's effort that's never good, was it the bench that has revitalized his game, at least in the short term, this past Saturday?
Yeah, I think a little bit. And I think he kind of maybe admitted as much. Archie Miller sort of alluded to as much after the game, because it's worth pointing out, obviously, he has a career game against Michigan State, but he's also very good in an unexpected start against Wisconsin on Tuesday night before I think he fouls out by the end of that game. But he had something like 12.6 rebounds, was a real kind of solid foil on a night where Juwan Morgan's offense just wasn't quite coming as easily as it sometimes does. But I think that there's an extension to that conversation, too. And I get a lot of people who roll their eyes when I bring up injuries and everything that this team's had to deal with. But you can't bench Justin Smith, or at least you can't play the matchups a little bit more if you're Archie Miller, if you don't have a healthy Race Thompson, and if you don't have a healthy Deron Davis. And this team's never going to be full strength because Jerome Hunter's not going to play this year. But I don't think it's a mistake. I don't think it's a coincidence that this team's performances have improved both individually and in the collective as they've gotten healthier and they've gotten some of the depth back that Archie Miller talked about really this team needing as far back as September, October to have to realize its potential.
Zach Osterman's on the Andy Moore Automotive Group Hotline. How do you view IU's resume right now? I mean, it's somewhat incredible to look.
As weird as this season, that's what it feels like at this point.
Would people down there tell you, or fans that get back to you tell you, that this has been the most odd, weird, as you mentioned, season that we have seen in a long time, the way this thing has gone?
I think so. I mean, I think that's probably fair. And it obviously swung wildly from, oh, wow, this team's got all sorts of problems and issues and injuries and whatever, but to 12-2 to, good Lord, how did this get so out of control? They've lost 12 of 13. Now all of a sudden they're 15-14. And, I'll hear from people who say, I don't care what you tell me. I don't understand how a team that lost 12 of 13 during conference play can be on the NCAA tournament bubble. I understand that sentiment. On the other hand, bubble teams don't have these kinds of wins, and bubble teams also typically tend to have bad losses, and Indiana really doesn't have any of those. And even if Indiana loses to Illinois on Thursday night, that's the only way it could pick up a loss that the NCAA selection committee would look at this point as a real negative would probably be Rutgers at home on Sunday, and that's really as much down to the strength of the Big Ten, obviously, and Indiana may be taking care of some business in the non-conference season. But listen, there's quantity losses there. I don't dispute that. But bubble teams don't usually have a season sweep of Michigan State, beat Wisconsin, beat Louisville. Basically no bad losses. Usually bubble teams are bubble teams because they have a bunch of bad losses on their resume, and it's just a question of the committee trying to figure out which one can weight the wins against the losses and kind of fall into the field. Indiana's got just a weird resume, and I know I've talked to some people who think that if Indiana just gets to 17-14, whatever happens in Chicago, they're in. I don't know if I quite believe that, but that's how bizarre their resume is that there are people that I know that are smart, experienced NCAA tournament projection folks who think 17-14 might really be enough to get them on the right side of the bubble.
I know that, Zach, this depends on who they play and who they beat. But do you think this team, and I'm just talking about overall body of work, is this team worthy of going to the NCAA tournament?
I think, yeah. I mean, you're right, first of all, that it kind of does depend on who they play and who they beat. And if you, to my mind, if I'm going to say yes to that question, the first thing is I think they need to win out in the regular season. And I don't think that'll be easier. I think Illinois is going to be a real challenge on Thursday night. Illini are playing better the last month and a half than they were for a lot of the first part of the season. They play an unusual, aggressive, sort of pressing defensive style that I think is going to really challenge Indiana. So I'm not sitting here and saying Indiana's definitely going to win out, period. But I think they need to do that first. And then if they can win like a game in Chicago, maybe two, I think one game would do it, frankly, but maybe two, then I think you can start to build a body of evidence that says, yeah, listen, this team had a miserable January and a better but still pretty, rough February. But look at what they did in the early part of the season. Look at just how deep the injury crisis got in January and early February. And look at, as they got healthy, the kind of team they turned into. Because if Indiana does do that, let's say Indiana wins its last two and then wins two in Chicago, that's a 6-game winning streak going into March, going into Selection Sunday. Even if they were to, let's say, I think under most scenarios, if they win these last two, they'd play Minnesota on Thursday in Chicago, whether they'd be the 8 seed or the 9 seed, they'd play Minnesota. Let's say they beat Minnesota and then lost to somebody like Wisconsin or Michigan or somebody like that on the Friday. You'd still say, yeah, but this is a team that finished the season, beat Wisconsin, beat Michigan State, won at Illinois, beat Minnesota in a neutral site game. Those are all really, really good wins. And it's not just recency bias because they also had a great non-conference season, and then there was just this big black hole in the middle where they had a ton of injuries and lost a lot of depth. And so I think that at that point you could make the case to me that Indiana was an NCAA tournament-worthy team. But again, they'd only be doing that in part because they would be building sort of a body of work here at the end of the season that suggests this is what the real Indiana looks like.
Zach Osterman's on the Eddie Moore Automotive Group hotline. I get what you just said. The one thing I don't get, so you're saying that if they lose to Illinois, Thursday night, you think that they still have a chance?
I think they'd have to do a lot more in Chicago. Maybe play to Saturday, maybe even play to Sunday. It's weird because this time of year, we're talking about teams in this kind of position needing quality wins. You're always looking if you're like a sort of a middling team in like a Big East or a Big Ten, maybe you're right there on the bubble. You're hoping not only to be able to get to your conference tournament, draw a big time team, but then also beat that team. Like you almost want to play Michigan or Michigan State or Purdue because you don't really have a chance of getting a resume building win going into Selection Sunday without playing that team, however difficult that game might be. Indiana's now suddenly in a position where they need quantity of wins. They have the quality they need. If Indiana had beaten, let's say, and I know they haven't, but I'm just playing fantasy basketball here, if they'd managed to beat Rutgers on the road, Northwestern on the road, and maybe Nebraska at home or Purdue at home or Ohio State at home, one of those, Ohio State and Purdue in particular games that they lost close, and we were talking about a team that was 18-11, they'd be in no problem. And it's just a question of basically all of a sudden Indiana's a team that's got all the quality in the world that it would need to be an attractive bubble team. They need quantity, though, and that's why I think that winning these last two is really important for them because it gets them that quantity, and it continues to fuel this idea that, hey, listen, actually the real Indiana was 12-2 on January 4th, got itself together once it was healthy again in February, and look what it's done down the stretch here. And there's no perfect, bubble argument. Any team that's on the bubble is there inherently because there are some pretty glaring cons to their resume, and Indiana's no different. But I also just don't think if Indiana did do that in that scenario, win these next two, maybe win one in Chicago, I don't think you'd be putting them up next to other teams and finding that any of those teams had anywhere near the number of good quality wins Indiana.
I find it hard to believe that you can at some point completely dismiss a team losing 12 of 13, though. You know what I mean? I mean, that's really hard for me to do.
And the selection committee might feel the same way you do. I mean, the other thing that's worth pointing out in this whole process is it's subjective. And yes, the committee absolutely holds criteria that it lays out beforehand, and it tries to sort of judge everybody together. But at some level, you're still looking at the eye test, or I won't say the eye test, but it's still humans running the rule over these teams. It's not a formula you plug into a computer and simply say, listen, spit me out the 68 best teams according to these different criteria. And it's also something that's also affected by what happens in those small conference tournaments. Do you think, for example, Wofford and Buffalo, both teams who, if they win their conference tournament, will probably come from one-bid leagues, the MAC and I think Wofford's in the Southern Conference. Do you think those teams are worthy of at-large bids if they lose in their conference tournaments? I think the answer is probably yes. So then all of a sudden the bubble shrinks. And so there are a lot of moving parts. And I'm with you in the sense that, listen, it's really strange to think a team can go 1-12 in conference play,
right,
and make the NCAA tournament. On the other hand, under that scenario, they'd still be 8-12, which isn't the worst record in a conference where there are precious few, if any, bad losses when you look at KenPom and the net rankings and those sorts of things. And then again, you'd circle back to this conversation about, does anybody else have these quality wins? And some of these quality wins would be stacked up in February and March. It wouldn't be like Indiana was, 17-3 and then just totally cratered. They cratered in the middle, but they would have been good at both ends.
Zach Osterman, the Stars on the Andy Moore Automotive Group hotline. To this point in the almost 2-year career in Bloomington for Archie Miller, how has this gone compared to how you thought it was going to go?
Last year didn't really surprise me a ton. And there were probably some games that you could have argued Indiana should have won or even lost along the margins. But when you thought about what he inherited, an 18-win NIT team that lost 3 players immediately to the NBA, that was going to be difficult. I don't think anybody I don't think you can possibly begrudge anyone who looks at the season and doesn't feel some disappointment. I don't really think it would be fair to look at any fan and say you were absolutely not allowed to feel any disappointment about this season. Now, again, I circle back to kind of this idea that I think the injuries this year have been more of it than a lot of people realize. It was interesting. Tom Izzo kind of had this sort of rubbing gravel through his hair press conference after Indiana beat Michigan State, obviously, this weekend, where he was kind of lamenting some of his own injury issues and the depth he doesn't have, and guys who are out, guys who are playing hurt, guys who just can't give him the minutes that they were giving him a month ago. And he was talking about Indiana, and he said they just kept running those big bodies at us. They kept running those forwards at us and making it harder and harder and harder. And I just thought, when was the last time anybody could talk about Indiana as a team that could just run bodies at people? Because I was watching Indiana basically roll with 6- and 7-man rotations through all of January and even parts of February, or at least getting into February before they started to get health back. And so I think anyone who feels some disappointment in this season in the way that it's gone is totally justified. I do think there was a lot made when Fred Glass used that term rebuild when he spoke to the Board of Trustees a while ago. I actually, just out of curiosity, Googled my byline and the word rebuild. I used it a decent amount last year, and I just in the way I was describing what I was kind of seeing or chronicling, I don't really remember a lot of pushback then. So this idea that nobody ever saw it as a rebuild. Everyone seemed happy to accept that last year. I don't think it would be realistic to think that it was completely done this year. I think that process is still ongoing. I think that there are certainly some positive signs as you've seen Archie Miller get most of his team back. On the other hand, I actually think that maybe now, this week, plus going into next week, you don't want to make a coaching tenure all about just a few games. But now maybe is where you can really kind of place some expectations on Archie Miller and say, listen, you've got a team that's about as deep as you wanted. You've got a team that's playing well. You've got a team that really seems to be embracing your ideals at the right time of year. Now's when maybe we should expect you to see you be able to do some really meaningful things with it. And maybe, not just potentially get to the NCAA tournament or even the NIT this year from a place that looked so hopeless a couple weeks ago, but show us sort of signs of what this is going to look like long term, irrespective of who's on your roster and why it's going to work year after year after year.
Illinois is coming up on Thursday on the road in Champaign. I had said this. I thought you got to win until at least the third game of the Big Ten tournament. And you probably have looked at the metrics more than me. I just think you kind of got to start there before you can even come to a grasp of a legitimate discussion about them being in. But, that's just what the numbers read, I guess, in a soft bubble year. It's kind of incredible that they could lose to Illinois Thursday and still, in some form or fashion, make a run down the stretch after losing 12 of 13. I guess, all in all, that's really tough for me to get over because of the program, and I know history doesn't, I know none of this matters, but 12 of 13 just seems like incredibly embarrassing. It just does, no matter what time of the season.
I don't think that's totally unfair, and I think that's probably a reflection of college basketball more widely this year. I put together a top 25 ballot for the AP every week, and it's not exactly this way, but if you really think about it, 1 through 4 are 1 seeds, 5 through 8 are 2 seeds, and on the way down, once you get past about like number 16, 17, 18. It's gotten, even talking about teams that will probably be in conversation for a 5 seed, a 6 seed, a 7 seed this season, it's gotten a little bit, there's a lot of just sort of debating and kind of picking your own adventure because even at that point you start to get some really kind of hot and cold resumes. It's just been a weird year.
It's, well, there he is right there. You got Illinois and Rutgers, Zach, to close it out in the Big Ten tournament in Chicago, and some weirdness going on right there. So pick your own adventure sounds like you have an infant there too. You guys picking your own adventures, stuff like that to watch on the computer or what? Is that where that came from?
No. I'm thinking back to the old Goosebumps books, but he picks the adventure pretty much all the time. His first birthday is Wednesday, and he was born on a Tuesday last year, 4 weeks ahead of schedule. And my wife actually went into labor because everyone remembers the Big Ten tournament was this weekend last year.
Right.
I was in New York that entire weekend covering IU and then helping cover Purdue. They went all the way to the title game, and my wife called me the Monday morning after the tournament was over while I was packing up my hotel room to fly home and said, hey, I think I'm going into labor. So he's been picking our adventures pretty much for the last year, starting with a very, very unexpected one, which was, all right, basketball season's over. Let's get this thing rolling.
Did you get back in time?
I did, yeah. That was a Monday, and he was born at like 1:16 a.m. on the Tuesday. So I got back in tons of I'd planned to stay, when you go to tournaments and stuff, you have to book, whether it's a tournament or, an NCAA tournament weekend or something like that, you have to book like they're going to be there the whole time just so you don't wind up without a hotel room for the second game or whatever. And because of bad weather and also Purdue just advancing on and on and on, they just left me out there to help out. And so I'd already planned to come back that Monday. I was literally packing up to go to LaGuardia, and then it was like, all right, well,